You're listening to JournoCast with Lewis Thompson.
As a woman in journalism, I'd never want to be seen to be like emotional. You've just lost your book deal. And I was just like, I felt like a competition winner. Do journalists does anyone realise, do fans realise that these women are having full-time jobs and then playing rugby? I've had it worse. Like, I've gone to cover rugby matches and realised there's no women's toilet. I don't want to kick off about this because then I'm the woman that kicked off about it. For young people breaking in, I'd always say,
Jess, I wanted to just start with talking to you about the book that you released not so long ago. March, you released The Red Roses, behind the scenes with the England women's rugby team. And it got me so interested because not only is it hard to write a book on something that's quite unknown to a wider audience, but I'm really fascinated about that process in general. So talk to me about when that first idea came into your head to when it was then published. What was that whole entire process like?
It's a really good question because it was difficult to kind of get started. I didn't know what to do. I've never written a book before. I've got colleagues who've written books before, but not kind of anyone in my personal life that's done it. So I wasn't really sure where to start, but I knew I really wanted to cover this story of the England women's rugby team. And actually, my agent, Mel, got in touch and said, there's a publisher that really wants a book about women's rugby. Would you want to write something like that? And I was like, absolutely. So Mel then offered to represent me. And it was the deal was dependent on England winning the World Cup final, which they didn't in 2022. So it's the 21 World Cup that played in 2022. And I was actually hosting an event, like a World Cup watch party, at the time of the World Cup final. And when this line out happened in like the final moment and New Zealand won the game, it was such a fine margin. I had to go straight on stage and present an event and host a panel with Hugo Monnier and Giselle Mather. And I was actually really upset because I just realised I'd lost my book deal and I'd already done so much work for this book and then it was all going to go. So I actually almost lost it. So that was the process then, was trying to find a publisher that would still want to tell the story. And for me, I actually think it's a more interesting story because everyone expected them to win. They were the favourites by far. Like, people thought there was almost no point playing the World Cup because England were so far and away the winners. They'd beaten New Zealand by record margins on 2 successive weekends only the autumn before. And yet they lost. And it was quite interesting actually then how they recovered from that and why it happened and what went wrong and what could be better when everyone saw them as the perfect team. So that's kind of how it came about. And then my publisher, Arena, which is an imprint of Berlin publisher up in Edinburgh, they were really interested in the story and thought that they agreed that it was actually more interesting. And I was just lucky that someone took the chance because, as you say, women's rugby isn't a huge sport. People don't know the stories and actually they're really interesting. And if you just listen for a few minutes to some of the incredible stories from the history of women's rugby and also then the current teams, it does make you realise that there's a book there. There's a few books there, I hope.
I just want to go back to when you said that you were hosting a live watch along for the final.
Yeah.
England against New Zealand. It kind of reminds me of the saying, never bet on your own sports team, whether that's in football or rugby, because then it's kind of double jeopardy. And not only is your team lost, but you've also lost the bet. So can you recall being in that stage thinking oh my word, I've just lost, there's so much work has went into this. And so how did that process then look after that? How did it come about that, oh no, it's okay, we will get the book out there?
Well, I remember thinking I can't look upset because then people will think that I'm upset for England, and that's not, as as a journalist, you're always unbiased. And I was worried that people would think that I was upset about it. And also I would say as well that as a woman in journalism, I'd never want to be seen to be emotional because then it's just kind of used as an insult. So I was like, right, stop, you've got to be calm. But I was presenting this event and my dad was actually in the audience because he loves women's rugby. When he found out I was hosting this event in Twickenham, he wanted to go. And it was actually him coming up to me just before I went on stage, and he was like, "You've just lost your book deal." And I was just like, the worst timing for anyone to say that to me, because I was, watching.
And you can't exactly tell anyone else either, because it's kind of kept under the carpet.
Secret. Yeah, so it was a really tough thing of being like, don't let this be a personal thing. This is much bigger. This is about a much bigger thing. The book, the book isn't happening. That's fine. I'll do something else and whatever. But it was actually really a weird morning, because obviously this happened at like 7 a.m, because it was in New Zealand time, the game. So not great. And then the process after that really was more Mel, my literary agent, who then went to different publishers and convinced them that there was still a book there.
And Jess, just talk to me more about. I'm really fascinated about just the sitting down day to day, and how did the book start to come along? And did you have a set plan for the chapters and people you wanted to speak to, or was that just something that came along naturally? Because I'm sure every author has their own unique way of doing how they want to set out their book. But what was your kind of style and your approach to it?
Yeah, it's so I thought, okay, here's roughly what I want to cover. And so I knew I wanted to cover the pioneers and the beginnings of women's rugby in England, because that's really interesting to me. I knew I wanted to make sure that I spoke about the transition into professionalism, because women's rugby has come a long way in the world, but in England in particular, from kind of really amateur grassroots era into professionalism. And I just wanted to make clear that it wasn't like an overnight jump, that there were plenty of people who fought the way and made that transition. So I knew that as much as I could, I wanted to talk about them and give them credit for what they'd done. So the first 2 chapters are about the pioneers and also the people who kind of grew the Rose to where it is now. But it's very much, I wanted it to very much be a book about the current squad. So the biggest chapter is about the 21 World Cup. So I knew that was going to be a chapter. I knew I wanted to talk about the kind of high performance environment and what England were doing that other nations aren't doing, or weren't doing at the time. Some stuff, especially around nutrition, England were leading the way on. And I wanted to kind of go into the high performance environment. I know people find that stuff really interesting. I certainly do. So I knew that I wanted to go into camp. So I did stay in camp with the players I was in over a period of about 3 weeks on different days to get a real sense of what it was like to be in a Six Nations training camp. And then I also wanted to talk about what happens next. So I had like rough ideas of, this is what I want to tell. These are the stories I want to tell. And these are the subjects I want to cover. And I decided for that I needed to speak to about 5 players. I spoke to all players. I should just preface that. I spoke to pretty much every single player, every coach of England at the time, quite a few former coaches, quite a few ex-players as well. Travelled all around the country to go and see different like former players, former coaches, as well as current ones. But I knew that I wanted to have a group of about 5 or 6 players who I could tell stories through. So I had, I always get so scared I'm going to forget one of them, but I had Marley Packer, Jess Breach, Maud Muir. They were like the main 3, I would say. But then I had Abby Ward and Emily Scarrett as well. And I basically just told the stories through their eyes at times, with their permission, with their like full support. And they were the ones who I had like a much closer contact with throughout writing the book. So if I had like a quick question, I'd text one of them rather than kind of having to go through media and all of that, which was really nice. England Rugby trusted me with that. They had no editorial control over the book, I should say. It was, they didn't want to see it. I did offer them the chance to see it before it went out, and it isn't an entirely positive PR book for England. There are parts of it which I'm sure they cringed at if they've read it. But yeah, so I kind of had a rough idea, and then I was led very much by the players, the staff, because I wanted it to be an authentic tale of England women's rugby. So I thought, have a rough idea, but I want to make sure that they're the ones telling the stories, not me.
Yeah. And Jess, you've been pretty heavily involved with rugby ever since your time going back to uni in Swansea. And you said there that you were in and amongst the players for about 3 weeks in the training camp. I mean, that must have been a pretty surreal experience for someone like yourself who has, had this love for women's rugby for pretty much all of her childhood and growing up.
Yeah, I felt like a competition winner for sure. Like seeing all the shirts laid out, and just like the players have a lot of chill time, so they're kind of sitting around on sofas and stuff. And I always try to not get in the way and be a fly on the wall and an observer. But a lot of them are women my own age, and so they'd start conversations about Married at First Sight Australia or EastEnders or all these. Or one of them was, what would you do if you were in a plane crash? Would you brace for impact or not? And like I got drawn into those conversations. So you do end up having those conversations, but while also trying to kind of be a fly on the wall. So it was amazing. Honestly, the best days of writing the book were the ones where I was in camp, especially when I got to like go to the training sessions, because as you say, like I'm a huge rugby fan. Before I was a journalist, and played women's rugby, love watching women's rugby, and it honestly, that was pretty surreal being in camp, seeing them, but also like being able to sit down with some amazing women's rugby players, women's rugby coaches, etc., and just ask them the questions that you want to know. Like that, I would always say that is the best part of journalism, is that you just get to it's like having an excuse to be nosy, because you can just ask the question, and if they say I don't want to answer that, that's fine, because it's an interview, it's journalism. But you could just be quite nosy and find out things you've always wanted to know. So a lot of the stuff I was interested in was about how England like tactically are aware, how they play, and you just get to sit down with like the experts in it and ask them questions. And I think that's the most fun part. Sorry, I'm rambling now, because I always love that bit of journalism. But yeah, so that's pretty much how I felt.
Yeah, I'm sure that is incredibly interesting. I mean, I'm a big Liverpool fan myself. I can't even imagine, going into Anfield and speaking to all the players and all, Jess. But I think that leads really nicely on to the next thing I want to ask you about, is when your initial spark for journalism started, because obviously, as I just mentioned, you were very involved in women's rugby at uni, but you also studied journalism at uni. So the path was pretty clear from uni, if I'm right in saying that those two would eventually, cross over, and that's what you would go into. But is that something that you always wanted to go into, if you can think even before uni?
No, I wanted to be a politician. And so I studied politics as my undergraduate degree, and I wanted to be a politics journalist. That's really because I kind of wanted to be a politician when I was younger, and I did a lot of activism as a teenager. And I was actually in a Channel 4 documentary about my activism when I was 14. And I really wanted to be a Labour MP. That was my ambition in life. And then I studied politics, and I was writing alongside that for blogs. I'd been writing for political websites since I was about 13 under a man's name, and pretended to be older than I was. And I'd write, and I knew I loved writing, and I wanted to write about politics or women's rights, really. And then, as you say, I was playing rugby at university. I did my master's degree in journalism. And while I was studying, I was playing rugby, and the head of rugby there was Siwan Lillicrap, the Wales captain. And one day I was like in her office, and she was telling me about her week, and it just sounded crazy, going to train like 4 times a week, playing 2 games a week, coaching all the other days. She literally didn't have an evening or day off the whole week. And it was during the Six Nations. I just thought, like, do journalists does anyone realise, do fans realise that these women are having full-time jobs and then playing rugby? I managed to get work experience at the Sunday Times magazine, and you'll know Clive Petty, who's on the desk at the Times Sport. Absolutely adore him. And I was walking past the sports desk every day, and I'd just kind of like stand there and like listen, or like pretend to be reading the newspaper. And one day he was just like, "What do you want?" And I said, "I want to do work experience at the Times Sport." And he said, "Oh, great. Go and chat to him." So I spoke to David Jordan, and I got work experience at the Times Sport. And while I was there, sorry, this is a long story, but while I was there was a piece published in the Times where one of the journalists was suggesting moving the games, the Women's Six Nations matches, to a Wednesday. And I was like, do they not realise that they have jobs? Like, there are doctors, nurses, prison officers, all these plumbers, all these different jobs that play in the Women's Six Nations. So I just thought that actually someone needs to talk about this and maybe make it like a story. So I offered to write the piece, they said yes. I wrote it, and it actually did really well. And Joe Hare, who's also at the Times Sport still, offered if I'd like to stay on an extra week. And I did. And I think he was expecting something really, like, something equally good, because that had done, like, particularly well. And I remember he came back from a meeting where he'd gone to the editors and was talking about the stories they had. And the editor had said that he liked that story. Anyway, the next week, all I wrote about was the goat that leads the Welsh team out for the national anthem in the rugby. So they didn't make me stay on another week. I think they were happy then that I'd done my one piece. But yeah, so actually I didn't want to be a rugby journalist at all, kind of growing up. And actually, I should say I didn't really get into rugby until I was about 18. I didn't have a rugby team near me. No one in my family watches rugby, apart from my dad, but only for like World Cups. Now he's really into it. But and I didn't have a rugby club anywhere near me, like to grassroots, or I went to a state school that didn't have a rugby team or anything like that. So yeah, I just kind of thought, I want to be a writer. I want to be a journalist. I like talking about stories that make a difference and people who are really inspiring. And I've been exposed to it through women's rugby, and I love women's rugby. So why not write about something that I love?
And then eventually you got a full-time job at the Times.
Yeah. They
Talk to
actually
me about
that. So I after university I joined the Association for the Self-Employed and became the digital editor of their magazine there, and eventually became the editor. And then I saw the job come up at Times Sport, and I thought, well, hopefully, like, I feel like because they asked me to stay on for another week, I thought hopefully they like me, and there'll be people who put in a good word for me or whatever. But it wasn't like that at all. You had to do like this assessment that was quite difficult. It was all about sub-editing, which is what I was doing. And and then got an interview and then got the job. So that was huge. Like, getting a full-time job at the Times. I was only 23 when I got that job. And it was just huge. It just felt like, oh my God, I'm going to be working for the Times and the Sunday Times. And I didn't even realise then like how impactful that job would be. And I loved it. I absolutely loved working there, and all the every day was different. There were so many exciting days, and you know what it's like on that sports desk. It can be really fun at times and really hard work as well. But it's a great team there. So got some amazing opportunities at the Times, got to lead on the Sportswomen of the Year Awards last year. And I'd worked on them for 4 years before that as well, because I did it as a freelance before I joined the Times. Just loved it there.
Yeah. And I have to say, Jess, you were probably the nicest person when I was there for a week in February. You know, I remember rolling up thinking everyone would be dressed in suits and ties, and I walked in my suit and my tie, and I was like, oh, I'm thinking a wee bit overdressed here. But then as the week went on, you know, I lost the tie, I lost the blazer, and yeah, it was really good. And I've loved, you know, just seeing how that all operates. But Jess, I wanted to ask you, you hinted earlier on, you said something earlier about as a woman in journalism, you don't like getting too emotional. And the other day I had a really honest conversation with Alison Rudd, who you'll be very aware of, about, you know, how, and she said that it hasn't really changed that much from when she first went into it. She said men are much more welcoming than what they used to be like. But when she still goes into a written newsroom, it still is dominated largely by men. So I wanted to ask you, how have you found your experience breaking into? Is that anything you've ever thought about? Especially with women's rugby. Obviously, the men's game is much more popular than the women's game. But what's your sort of opinions on this, and how did you find operating as a female journalist on a news desk that was largely occupied by men?
Yeah, I mean, Alison's right, and we'll be talking about the same newsroom, and because it is all well, when I was there, it was all men who were kind of assistant editor or editor on Times Sport, and kind of heads of production. Like, all the senior desk jobs were men, and there are only 2 full-time female sub-editors as well, myself and Hannah Shattuck. And the writers, it's more diverse, but I know exactly what Alison means. And sometimes it's something that you try not to think about, or and I have to be honest, like I've never had, I can't really point to an example of like a bad experience I've had with that, but it's just something you're always really aware of when you're the only woman in the room. And sometimes it's as simple as like when you realize that they realize it. So they'll like, so often someone would say a joke that wasn't sexist or anything like that. It would just be rude. And then they'd be like, sorry, Jess. And I'm like, oh, you don't see me as one of you. You see me as like you have to protect me or something. Like just yeah, that sometimes is a little bit weird. I think it's worse. I've had it worse. Like I've gone to cover rugby matches and realised there's no women's toilet. I've turned up at Twickenham and been outside the press room with my press pass around my neck and been asked by a supervisor there if I'm meant to be in the catering room, as in like, am I meant to be making tea for the journalist, not actually a journalist? That's probably the worst example I've had of it. And it's also really hard when you are the only woman there and you're like, I don't want to kick off about this because then I'm the woman that kicked off about it, and you shouldn't feel like that. And I'm happy to kick off about sexism all the time. But when you're in a professional setting and you feel like you're representing all women in that setting rather than just yourself, you don't feel like you can be as vocal as you want to be, or at least I don't. And that's a criticism of me because you should do stuff like that, because if you don't, then no one else is going to do it for you. But yeah, it can be difficult. I think it's getting. I think it's getting better. There are more women in senior positions in major newspapers. I'd like to see that transfer to sport, because if you look at the makeup of the desks of news, like basically any other desk, the gender split is nowhere near as stark as it is on sport, and I think that's across most newspapers. But it is difficult. My new job now, I'm editor at Contested Sports App, and actually the senior leadership team there, if you like, is 3 women. It's myself, Maggie who runs marketing, and Darcy who runs product, and the founders are men, but we are kind of the people who are running the operation day to day, and we're all women, and it's such a difference. Just to have that kind of, to work with more women is lovely, and I just wish there were more women in those senior levels across all sports newspapers.
Yeah, and I want to touch on Contested just after this next question, but I asked Alison the same thing about what she would like to see change in the industry. That obviously it is getting better, but it's not where it should be, as you hinted at. And Alison said that there should be more voices, and that it can get quite same old when you're reading the same things from the same people, but it's just got a different style to it every week. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on that, if you have anything extra to add to that. How can the industry do better to get more people involved?
100%. The number of times I would edit something and have to say, as a woman, that's crap, that's rubbish. Like having to edit out stuff like grow a pair of balls, or change headlines because the men reading it haven't realised that that's sexist or not, or a bit offensive to women, or reductive of like a woman's success to her appearance or something like that. So I think you need to have women in the room. You need women in the room to read the room, because so often I would kind of say, guys, can we change that? That's not great. An example I can think of is when a footballer had he had a daughter and then a son, and one of the questions put to him was, are you pleased you've got a son that, so you can be a football dad now? And it's like, are you not realising what you're saying? Like in this day and age, to say that, it just shows such bias that you don't think, girls play sport or whatever. The coverage of women's sport in all papers needs to be better. The BBC's great, and I think the Telegraph did a lot of great things, but women's sport doesn't need to be women covering it, but it needs better coverage. And I think sometimes you do need women in those leadership positions for that to happen. I also think that just how we frame situations, like for example, I'll just use kind of the transgender route that's going on at the minute. I'm fed up of reading men talk about it and say how much they care about women's sport, but they only care about women's sport when they're covering the transgender stuff, and they never seem to write about women's sport when they're not talking about transgender people playing women's sport. So it's stuff like that I think could be quite frustrating. The whole sports industry needs to have more women writing, more women in those leadership positions, and also just better coverage of women's sport. This Olympics I think has been really good though for how women's sport's been covered. But yeah, that's something, especially when I was at the Times, I was kind of constantly trying to get some more women's sport in the paper.
I think that's really well said, Jess, and you actually have managed that, especially with this new contested app, which we're going to get onto here. And so the sort of transition between when you eventually left the Times and this new project started up, I'm going to be honest, I'm not quite as familiar, obviously, as yourself and other people are with contested. So tell me a bit about like that. What was it like leaving the Times, and was it just too good of an opportunity to turn down with contested?
Yeah, it was a tough one because I loved the Times, and going from the Times to a startup is a huge risk. But I'd been working with Contested as a consultant for about 7 or 8 months before I joined them, and I really liked what they were doing. And it's essentially trying to pass the microphone to players, give them their own platforms to talk about their own stories, and particularly with a focus on, at first, women's rugby, but also women's sport in general. And I just loved it as an idea. And the more I kind of got to know their mission and what they wanted to do with it, I thought, yeah, I want to be part of that. And so what we're doing at the moment is letting players tell their stories in a way that they haven't been able to before, with complete editorial control. So players get to, they talk to me, I write up their stories, their interviews, we're doing video content as well. And they get to have a say in how it's sold on social media and how it's spoken about. And I think it's building back a bit of that trust between the media and sports people.
Is this all written format? Sorry, is this all? Are they all writing? Is it video? Is it audio?
Well, we're definitely going to be looking to make it multimedia. So at the minute, we're working on just written interviews and video content. So video interviews and features. But we're looking to kind of expand that in the future as well to maybe podcasts and especially doing some more video stuff. But yeah, it's a really exciting new chapter. It's fun. I love what Contested stands for, and we're building, and it's changing all the time. It's startup in that nature that we're kind of constantly learning and then not changing direction but changing focus. So one thing we learned during the Women's Six Nations is that lots of players, what they really want is support with finding commercial deals and help with their social media and things like that. So we're now kind of working on that as well, and finding commercial deals for players, getting them sponsorship, finding them boot sponsors, or getting like companies to send them boots and products that they use. So we're kind of changing all the time, and it's so exciting because I get to spend most of my days just talking to players, genuinely helping them, and also building up that trust where then we can talk about really important topics, and they know that I'm not going to write a headline on it that's going to upset them or offend them or go viral for the wrong reasons, etc., etc. They have complete control, which has led to actually some really interesting interviews and actually players feeling like they can share things they haven't shared before.
So you're essentially trying to build that bridge between the players and the media and give the players a voice without having, any sort of editorial change, and just give them the freedom to express however they wish. Is that kind of how it comes across then?
Yeah, and I'd say that my input on that was having written the book and realising how much players were frustrated with the media, and I use the media like as if it's one company, but there was a lot of frustration, and lots of athletes are frustrated at how their stories are covered, or the focus is on one tiny thing and rather than kind of like how they're actually playing and stuff like that. So really my big thing was I want to have a platform where I can kind of give the microphone to a player and say, like, go for it. Like, I will help you. I will tell you if something's not interesting, and I will tell you if that's only interesting to you and your family and not the rest of the world, and encourage you not to kind of make boring content. But if it's interesting and exciting, and like, I can support you with that, I will help you write it. I will write it for you, or ghostwrite it for you, or I'll do an interview with you, or I'll help you I'll ask you the right questions. But I won't ever push you to tell me to share something you don't want to share. And you can tell me what you don't want to share, and then that will be it. And that's kind of the approach in some ways I went to with the book. There were certain topics where I gave players the option. I said to them, quite a big, maybe a controversial thing happened here. Do you want to talk about it? Do you want to and honestly, most of the time players said yes. And there was only one thing the player said, can we not? Every other thing they were like, yeah, because it got carried away, or that side of the story is not my side of the story. I want to give my side of the story. And I just realized that lots of players needed that. So that's what I'm trying to do at Contested. And so far it's been really, really good. Like, as an example, Hannah Jones, the Wales captain, wrote an apology letter to Wales fans during the Women's Six Nations to clarify why in her post-match interview she might have seemed disheartened or angry with the team. She wasn't at all. She wanted to explain it, and she did, and that went really well. Like, the BBC picked it up and it did really well on social media. So that's the kind of thing that we're doing.
And please try and give Ireland some more coverage, because I covered my only live rugby game with the Times was England versus Ireland at Twickenham in the Women's Six Nations, and it's probably the hardest match report I've ever had to write in my life, considering the tries just never stop coming in.
I have such sympathy.
It seems like a very interesting project, and hopefully it just keeps getting bigger and bigger. Just to finish off, for anyone breaking into the industry, male or female, like how do you sort of stay on top of things, stay organized, and keep pushing through when times get tough? Because I think especially the process of you writing your book, I think a lot of people can relate to that from a perspective of, obviously, time. There are times when you're sitting there thinking, God, like what next? And writer's block is a real thing, I feel. So what advice would you give to people on that front?
I think always make sure that you're aware of what the next innovation is going to be. And at the moment we're kind of on the AI wave. Make sure that you understand what's happening in the industry. Keeping your finger on the pulse there, especially with technology, is one way that you can stay ahead. In terms of things like writer's block, if I knew the answer to that, then I'd be so much more productive. It's really difficult. Although I find that the best thing to do when you're like completely stuck of like, I don't know what I'm doing with this or what to do, is just go and watch grassroots sport. Go and chat to actual fans and find out what they care about. Because so often as journalists, we get kind of sucked into the real nitty gritty detail of a story, and you forget that what fans, or it's easy to forget what fans actually care about. So chat to real life people. Like, the thing about touch grass, like, get outside and be in it.
See the
like
world.
Yeah, that's always my advice. But yeah, for young people breaking in, I'd always say be polite and persistent. Make sure people know who you are, and never be scared to pick up a phone. If you're scared to pick up a phone, like, journalism is going to be very tough for you. Be really friendly, chatty, make sure they remember your name, and like leave a good impression on people, and that will open more doors for you than any contact or parent in the industry or anything like that, which I never had.
Jess, that is phenomenal. Thank you so much for your time today. Honestly, I really appreciate it.